My name is William Smith. I'm the editor of Art in America magazine. And this evening or afternoon or morning, whatever the case may be, we're going to be discussing Donald Judd's writings and interviews. And I'm joined in this discussion by Caitlin Murray, an archivist at the Judd Foundation, and Flavin Judd. And together they edited these volumes that hopefully you can see on my screen now, or at least the two volumes here, Donald Judd's Writings, which was published in 2016, and Donald Judd Interviews, which was published last year. Let's to dive into the discussion. I just wanted to point out the scope of the work. Each one of the volumes that you put together is nearly or more than 1,000 pages. Judd was a hugely prolific writer, and he gave dozens and dozens of interviews over the course of his career. Some of the people listening in right now probably had an opportunity to see Judd, an important retrospective that was on view at the Museum of Modern Art for something like 2 weeks before it was closed for the pandemic. It really offered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see a wide range of the works that Donald Judd produced over the course of his career. And I think we're all hopeful that there's going to be a speedy reopening of that show as soon as New York gets somewhat back to normal. But in the meantime, I think this is actually a great occasion to focus on Judd as a writer and as a thinker, and to understand how writing and his public statements both sort of informed and deepened his artwork and design. You know, one of the things that a lot of critics, especially in the early 1960s, said about Judd's work and the work of some of his colleagues and peers was that there was nothing to say about it. And for a critic, this was a big complaint. And, you know, spare geometric forms, there's nothing figurative that they could really latch onto and have a conversation about. And I look at the writings and interviews that you've edited and put together as a clear rejoinder to that. I mean, Judd himself certainly had plenty to say about what he was doing, about what other artists were doing, about the art world, about the political world. He wrote statements, notes, and an important genre that he made all his own, the complaint, which I definitely want to get into a little bit later on. But first, Caitlin and Flavin, I'd love to get a sense of your process as editors. These are two enormous projects, writings and interviews, and I'm hoping you can tell people how you approach that. What were you looking for in creating these books?
Well, as you might know, there was previously 2 volumes of writings of Don's, one in 75 and one in 86. The 86 one long out of print and very small. So it had always been a desire to get the writings out. And once we completed the Spring Street building in 2013, we felt it was a time to focus on the book. And the basic idea was that it should be 1 volume, that it should be as complete as possible. And even if that meant a lot more work than simply putting together previously published stuff and leaving it at that, we felt that if we wanted to do it correctly in the right way, it was worth the work. So we basically had to start from scratch, and that meant going through all the notes, going through all the weird little writings that might have happened in notebooks, and gathering them all up.
Yeah. Caitlin, could you talk about the scope of the archive? I mean, what do these archives really look like?
Sure. So the archive is located in Marfa, and when we're talking about Judd Foundation archives, in this instance, we're talking about the Donald Judd Archive. And with writings in particular, we think about in terms of boxes, and there are over 30 boxes of material that we have organized as Donald Judd Writings. So this is manuscripts and handwritten manuscript notes and any sort of clippings or articles associated with what he was writing. And it's really comprehensive. I mean, we're very lucky that Judd saved a lot throughout his life. And so that gave us the ability to include, for example, 3 essays that he wrote while he was a student at Columbia. So before his kind of formal career as an art critic began in September 1959, we decided to include some of these essays written while he was a graduate student at Columbia University. And so, yeah, as Flavin said, you know, this was a longstanding goal of the foundation to continue to put out Judd's writings, especially since the volumes that Judd had produced, some of them were very much out of print. And so the process began with a large push to organize the archive and really look across what we had. And one of the things that we knew was there, and we weren't quite sure the extent of, were these notes that Flavin described. So these are not the larger, longer essays that we know of that were published, but more of a, not quite a everyday, but a daily writing practice. It's fairly responsive. And so that entailed quite a bit of effort because all of these notes were in handwritten form.
Does he have good handwriting? Was it legible?
No.
No. So yeah, so basically what we had folders and folders and folders in these boxes, and I would do my best to transcribe them and get as complete a accounting of what these notes contained. And then at some point they kind of began to resemble something more like a Mad Lib. And then, you know, when Flavin would sit down with them and, you know, depending on how difficult the handwriting is, would take hours and hours and days of comparing the handwritten manuscript to my Mad Lib version and making corrections and additions and seeing if we could actually get a coherent statement together. So we really did try to include everything that we could read.
You put together 2 volumes, one focused on writings and another on interviews. And I was hoping you could talk about the relationship between those 2 volumes. Do you see them as closely connected, or is there a distinctive figure that emerges from the writing versus you know, Donald Judd making public statements in interviews?
Flavin?
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Well, I think we definitely viewed these as companion volumes, as, you know, Flavin can discuss certainly in terms of the design and the unity of the design. But something that stuck out to me in particular when we were working on the writings was that the areas where Judd kind of described why he was writing, which he said in 1986, you know, writing is a further attempt to maintain my work and control what happens to it, to maintain my integrity, my momentum against other distortions. And I feel like the same can be said in a lot of ways about Judd and what he was doing in discourse and interviews and panel conversations. It was a way for him to maintain his work and to provide a sense of what he thought was important about his work that wasn't just derived from these categorizations of minimal or trying to make easy associations.
Caitlin, you mentioned that he started writing art criticism in 1959. And I'm curious how you both would characterize his art criticism, his critical writing. What did he aim to achieve as a critic? And what was he looking for when he was in other artists' work? Do you think that was informing his approach, or do you think it was a kind of distinctive sphere for him?
I mean, one of the main things to realize is that he was, as he stated, he was doing criticism as a job. He wanted to be an artist, but he never expected an artist to make any money. And prior to that, he had been working at a hardware store and an art supply store and teaching. and art criticism was a way to pay the rent and kind of still be able to be engaged. But what you see in the reviews of the shows, which I might point out are not in the Orange Book, but are in the 1975 Yellow Book, and which we did not reproduce in the Orange Book because they're already well documented, and we wanted to keep the 1975 Yellow Book around. What you see if you read his reviews is that he's using his writings, his writing about other people's work to figure out his own work. And I mean, I don't really know if this is so typical of artists, or if this is so visible in other artists. But in Don, you can see for instance, his praise of Bontekoe and her radicality is something that he was desperately trying to achieve. And you can see his praise of Jack Wesley and Lichtenstein in their flatness, and in Frank Stella's achievement of a non-representational space. And in all of these cases, he's working towards what he thinks about art, which goes into his artwork in the late 50s, early 60s. So while he started it as a job and as a mercenary, as he said, clearly it was used as a way to figure out what he wanted artwork to look like and to be.
Yeah, and I think there's both, as Flavin mentioned, you know, the work of other contemporaries, of friends of his that he admired and thought was doing something new, which he addresses in Specific Objects, which is, you know, undoubtedly his most well-known and famous essay. But I think also something that's striking to me about the reviews, especially when Judd's considering artists of the previous generation that he admired, I tend to believe that helped clarify for Judd what direction he wanted to go in. So, you know, for example, he wrote pretty significantly about Barnett Newman and Jackson Pollock, and he, one of the things that he said is he felt like that they had arrived at a way of working that was natural to them, and that was something that was clear and thought out, and that was the only way that one would have to do that for themselves to be able to be on the same level with them. And so I think writing criticism helped kind of determine where the level was in terms of the best art of a generation, and what qualified as new and inventive, and not just repeating the accomplishments of the past.
He took the critical role very seriously, though he might have understood himself to be a mercenary. And I don't know, maybe some people listening will chuckle at the idea of turning to art criticism for financial stability. But he was really, my impression is he was really interested in making distinctions between practices that he felt were viable and good, and dismissing pretty much everything else. The superlatives really come across in his writing. Lee Bontekoe, for instance, is someone who identified as a credible and awesome artist. Kusama was also doing work that he found original in a similar kind of vein. But he had very little tolerance for anyone who was doing anything mediocre or repetitive. And you don't really encounter that kind of dismissive today, that real sense of judgment coming through even in art criticism.
Well, I think that's just part of his personality, and the standard he held others to was the same he held himself to. And that's why he didn't have a show of his own artwork from 57 until 63 when he had his first show at the Green Gallery, because he didn't think his work was strong enough. And as he says more than once, as if you read the Orange Book, the Writings book, if you try to copy Matisse, you'll just wind up being a bad bad second-rate Matisse. So the goal is to not be Matisse, even as much as you might admire Matisse. And I think that kind of seriousness and that approach is something that that you can see in his art and in his writings, and it's comes from the same source.
I totally agree, and I think one of the things that is a through line in that kind of the ability to make a judgment or to be critical is that kind of empirical leaning. I mean, throughout the writings, and then in particular in the interviews, he always is talking about, you know, I leapt into the world an empiricist. Being an empiricist, you know, I'm a thorough empiricist. I'm skeptical, and so on. And I think that that kind of orientation to the world that is skeptical, that is empirical, fits really nicely also with the ability to look at work and make assessments and take critical positions. And I think also has to do with a political sensibility as well. You know, what you ask the art to do, what you expect art to be able to do, plays into that, also that mode of judgment.
One of the key terms in his art criticism is credibility. That term comes up again and again. And actually, there's an interesting essay by Robert Slifkin that was recently published in a book that delves into credibility as a key term for the 1960s, thinking about a credibility gap in politics. But I'm curious about what credibility meant to Judd. What was credible art? And did he ever find it in his own work?
Well, yeah, I mean, because that comes from a disenchantment in kind of the narratives of art history and the kind of European tradition of representation. And so if you're not going to believe in those things, if you feel that you have to find something else, then it has to be credible and believable. And all of those things were what he did not believe in. The philosophy was not credible, not believable. The religion was not credible, was not believable, and neither was the representation, because it came from the same thing.
Yeah, and I think when I think of credibility in Judd's work, one of the things I think about is his relationship to knowledge, and knowledge being something that is created and also tested. So again, going back to this kind of empirical stance that also I think has bears relationship to his position with science. I mean, he's someone who I think says, maybe I forget if it's in the interviews or the writings, that, you know, he would have loved to have been a scientist if he had been so inclined, had the kind of talents and skills for that. But instead, you know, in terms of working with art, that sort of credibility comes across in terms of material and space and color, and the sorts of the questions about these sorts of things like material and color and space, he really analyzes throughout the writings. And especially when you get to an essay, some aspects of color, the last essay in writings, he's really making a case for what is credible in art, and a kind of assessment that's quite in line with his thinking 30 years previously in specific objects, which are kind of can maybe be viewed as bookends in this kind of assessment of the what is new in art and what is credible in art.
Another key term in his writings and interviews could be democracy. He seemed to have very specific ideas about what democracy meant as a political concept and also as an aesthetic concept. So, you know, Caitlin, you mentioned his political statements, and he considered himself to be a political artist. But maybe when some people look at his work, it's harder to understand because maybe there's a popular idea about political art being representational in a certain way. So could you, Caitlin or Flavin, could you talk about what it meant to him to call himself a political artist?
So to start, I mean, one of the writings that I come back to a lot, and that I find really crucial in this question, is from 1970, and it's a response that Judd gave to a symposium question, and it was called "The Artist in Politics," and I'll just read a short bit because I think it really gets to the heart of it. He says, "At any rate, I think everyone has to be involved in politics, in organizations that will defend their rights and obtain more, that will decide on what should happen in all public matters. If you don't act, someone else will decide everything." And then he goes on to stress that everyone is a citizen and is an equal part of a social organization. And I think that when I think about Judd's work and a stack, for instance, or in the large multicolored work that we're looking at, the individual pans, for Judd, he was interested in wholeness and a sense of unity. He was no longer interested in questions of composition of a bunch of parts that add up to a whole, but instead creating scenarios where every part is essential to a whole. And while that is not discursively political, I think that that kind of thinking of wholeness and of a developed democracy made up of citizens is kind of implicit in the form of the work. And Judd's an artist who's interested in the visual and the spatial and what is present. And so he's not going to articulate that in a words on a canvas or in video. He's working with the materials that are of most interest to him. But I think he does it in a way that I continue to find inspiring as a political, as a person with my own political agency. Flavin, I know like in this book, democracy was something, it was like, one of our jokes was like, if we don't know what the word is, maybe it's just democracy.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about democracy because, on the one hand, there is a close relationship that he describes between his art and his politics, where it's almost inescapable that someone making a strong individual statement through their work is a political act. But he was also careful to distinguish political and cultural democracy. So whereas democracy might be a political imperative with all citizens being equal, when it came to culture and aesthetics, there needed to be sharp distinctions and clear hierarchies between work that was excellent and good and everything else that was mediocre and trailing.
Yeah, they're different things, so you have to keep different distinctions. And to mix them up is actually, to him, a big mistake.
How would you characterize his political views overall?
Anarchist landowner.
Anarchist landowner? What does that mean?
It's kind of extreme Jeffersonian democracy, but you'll get shot if you step on somebody else's property.
There's one fairly lengthy letter written about low-flying helicopters over his property in Texas.
Well, because over the ranch house in Marfa, it's underneath an Air Force route for the trainers for training the pilots of B-1 bombers. And as you can imagine, for Don to drive 2.5 hours outside of Marfa to be quiet to work, and then have a B-1 bomber fly, 500 feet over your head, is extremely unpleasant. So he complained about it.
Well, maybe then we can talk about this genre of the complaint. And I don't think I mentioned this at the start. I set myself the task of reading through cover to cover the writings and interviews and trying to take away some lessons. And You can see that the essay I wrote out of that on the Art in America website. It's also published in our April issue. Yeah, I was very taken with the idea of the complaint. One thing I pointed out was that he would have been great on Twitter. He had a very sort of acerbic attitude. What was he hoping to achieve there? I mean, there's a lot of humor in it. There's a lot of sort of cantankerousness. But what was motivating these lengthy screeds against museums, art magazine editors, curators, other artists?
Well, I think it's a number of things. It's the realization that all the importance he put upon artworks and art and the practice was not shared by the art world at large. And there's plenty of instances of that in the books. And also in 1968, my parents bought the building in New York, and it was supposed to be big enough and far enough away from the rest of New York that it would be a comfortable place to live. But it turns out it wasn't necessarily. New York was very busy, very loud, and not that comfortable. So I think the complaints come out of, he would have been 45 in the early 70s. And so it's also kind of realizing that even if you gain a certain level of notoriety in his case, or fame, or whatever you want to call it, or success in the art world, it doesn't matter. Your art is still at the whim of huge institutions who have their own goals, and capitalist enterprises who use the art as less than a commodity, simply as a mere token of culture that they don't, themselves don't possess. So I think it comes out of a certain time in his life where whatever dreams he might have had early on about what one can do with art turned into a realization that you had to do it yourself, and nobody's going to help you. And in fact, it's going to be very hard even to make the artwork itself.
Right. I think when I think of the complaints part 1 and complaints part 2, one of the things I think about is advocacy, and Judd as being an advocate for his work and the work of other artists. And there are many ways that then that manifests itself later on in Judd's life. But yeah, thinking about these complaints as a form of advocacy, which is funny because, you know, the complaint in thinking about it as a genre, it's a kind of legal, a legal complaint, or in poetics, there's the kind of the plaintive poem, which is more like kind of writing about the sorrows of the world. And I think that those two kind of ideas of the complaint, one is a kind of legal advocacy, and the other one is kind of addressing the sorrows of the world. Like Judd blends those two together. In some ways, they are ethical and moral complaints against the bad critics and museums that are that don't represent the work well. And it's also perhaps more angry than sorrowful, but also thinking about the carelessness with which his work was being handled at that time. And Judd's writing and then the archive attest to a lot of irreparable damage that was being done to the mishandling of works. And then also another level of the damage being done when work is badly presented, or when false generalizations are made amongst other artists. So I think complaint is actually a very apt term for what he was doing.
Why did he keep at it? It seemed like if you read through his writings and interviews, it does seem like he's fighting an uphill battle here in a lot of ways. And I'm just curious, plenty of artists confronted the same kinds of issues that he did: lack of understanding, problems with the art world, the corruption, greed in the art world, the lack of intellectual interest. Why did he keep participating?
Because he loved the artwork. and he loved making it. And he realized that it's, I mean, you can't retreat completely from the world. And you have to deal with it on some level, and you do what you can.
And I think it does also go back to the kind of political question, right? Of like, even if the political situation looks completely bleak, the economic situation, whatever it's the given situation at the time, that's not an excuse for being a passive citizen. You still have to be active. That's your participation is a requirement of democracy. And I think that seemed to have been the case even, with the art world, that, you, even if it's exhausting and frustrating, that you had to participate and you had to be a voice, or otherwise, if you don't act, as he said, someone else will decide everything.
Also, in Don's case, it's clearly economics, because the artworks were very expensive to make. And if you stop engaging with the art world, well, then you don't make any work. So you didn't have a choice.
Yeah. Caitlin, you mentioned this sense of frustration and responsibility. And I think looking at the writings and interviews, one of the moments that really stands out as a galvanizing moment when he really had to consider what this means was during the Gulf War. And you said that he was not an artist who maybe would scrawl a message on a canvas, which is why this particular work that I'm showing now really does stand out, which is from 1991. So produced during the Gulf War. He had a very strong reaction to this. He referred to it as the US invasion of Arabia. And it seemed to crystallize a lot of long-held beliefs for him. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about why the Gulf War was so important for him, and why it seemed to be this crystallized, galvanizing moment.
Well, first to talk a little bit about this image. This is a poster from a photograph that was taken in Spain, and in 1991, and there are a number of instances where Judd used posters and used essays, writings to inject very forcefully political commentary alongside of the artwork. So not in place of, but adjacent to. So for example, at this time in the Gulf War, he writes an essay called No More War that is about the Gulf War, and he includes that in an exhibition catalog for an exhibition of architecture that he had in Vienna. And it's not directly about his art. It doesn't resemble anything like an exhibition, monograph, but I think he felt galvanized, and it was crucial for him because of, he felt like something like war, which he considered to be, as he says, a major crime, that it was really detrimental to art and architecture, that the kind of freedoms that one needs to be able to produce something excellent are really curtailed in a situation like the Gulf War. Even if the war is not, directly, it's not being fought on American soil. I think that that's just that participation and this kind of total disregard for what democracy is and should be affects, is the actual, if not in economics, is a trickle down, has a large trickle down effect in terms of culture. And Flavin, I mean, I'm sure you guys had a lot of conversations during this time about the Gulf War, so I'm sure you could speak to it directly.
Well, it was first of all just a demonstration of everything he had been complaining about for 20 years since the Vietnam War. It was demonstrated that that the government was just as stupid as it was in the Vietnam War and just as immoral. And he was simply furious about it. So it's that simple.
I wanted to ask, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for the questions that have been rolling in. And I wanted to ask you both about just Judd as a literary stylist. And has a very distinctive voice as a writer. And I'm curious if you, one that also might be consistent across the interviews as well. There's a lot of forcefulness, direct language. There's a lot of humor in what he's writing. And I'm also curious if you see a difference between the way he wrote notes ostensibly for private purposes and the way he wrote for public audiences in art magazines or in other venues.
I think the writing is a direct, as it all comes from the same source, the writing, the architecture, the design, the art. I think it's all pretty consistent, and the notes are written almost exactly in the style of the essays, and are occasionally only barely cleaned up to go into the essays. And I think the directness, and for instance, I'm using a word like complaints, which is as direct as one can get about a text. It all goes together and shows the consistency of what he was thinking and where it came from.
Yeah, and I think I remember when I first started. I'm sure Specific Objects was the first essay of Judd's that I read, and I remember, reading it and saying, okay, I get it, and then there'd be some sort of larger, broader statement about the general and the specific in art, or some sort of something quite categorical. They'd be like, okay, what does that actually mean? And over time, I feel like that's one of the things that is so interesting about Judd's writings, or even how he speaks in the interviews, is that there are these quite direct statements where he's describing something and it's all quite clear, and then there will be a really powerful but brief moment that is an articulation of a philosophical position or a stance that is quite complex, and over time, those things that seem like maybe they were tangential, I think you realize that they're all, as Flavin said, they're all come from the same place. And I like that Mel Bachner talked about Judd's writing and his reviews in particular, and about how he, in one review of a show by Roy Lichtenstein, he described one of Judd's statements as a riff about the sterile undercurrents of American popular culture. But in some ways, that idea of a riff on American culture, I mean, that's in some ways at the heart of a lot of Judd's writing. That it's the riff is actually in some ways the crux of it. That there is a critique or a complaint that is inherent to all of this thinking that's really grounded in a empirical, pragmatic way of understanding the world.
As a writer, and his texts are just full of rich citations, and they become more varied over time. So the later essays are very dense with quotes from other sources. We know Judd as a writer and a speaker and as an artist, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about Judd as a reader. What is his relationship to the library, for instance?
Well, if the library is 13,000 volumes, which kind of tells you a lot, Don read constantly, and I remember being very surprised when I was maybe a teenager or something, that not everybody did this. Not everybody was reading, constantly or every day for long periods, and didn't think it was important. And for Don, it was important to not only keep yourself informed, but it was, to him, it was important to always keep learning, and because you could never be finished. And that's why the library is 13,000 volumes, because there's a lot to figure out and a lot to learn. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of science, and you can't learn enough, and you can never stop learning. So there was lots of reading going on.
And
Yeah,
actually,
I mean,
we have a question from an anonymous attendee, sort of in this vein. Which philosophers did Judd prefer?
He was, being an empiricist, he did study philosophy when he was an undergraduate. And basically, he came from the Humean empiricist vein of philosophy, and had very little time for people like Hegel or Heidegger and metaphysics, because to him that was like religion, just totally not credible.
So I'm going to start going through some of these questions. The first is refers to a quote that we looked up a little bit earlier, where he describes the role of the artist as the gravel in the pea soup. And I'm curious what that phrase means to both of you.
Well, it's if you have a good artist, and this is part of like his work being political, if you have a good artist, they are not going to be part of the current culture, because they've made their own culture, and their own culture might be antagonistic to the current culture, and hopefully it is, because there's plenty in the current overall culture worth being antagonistic with. Hence the gravel in the pea soup.
I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind and thinking about the gravel in the pea soup is that, you know, it's obviously
Do you have
the
the full
gravel.
quote, Caitlin?
Oh yeah, I can pull the quote. I will read it. Oh, let's see. I believe in what I feel, know, and experience, and I follow the interests inherent in myself. The better artists are original and obdurate. They are the gravel in the pea soup. And that's from an essay called Art and Architecture from 1983. Yeah, when I think about that, I mean, I think certainly, you know, what Flavin said about an artist who can create their own situation. They're not just one of many. And I also think about something that came to my mind was thinking about how Judd constantly talked about a here and now situation and the present, and the gravel is something I think that would like really draws your attention and captures your attention to a kind of a here and now, or like the indexical present of Adrian Piper or something like that, that it's like it's in that moment, it catches you. It's not to be mistaken for the future or the past. It's in the present.
Here's a question about your process, and I'll wrap two together. First of all, how long did this undertaking take for you? And then secondly, how comprehensive or complete are these writings? Is there anything that you left out deliberately, or are there texts that people could expect at some later date?
So the process, I mean, it's something that the foundation was working towards for a long time. I think we really, in terms of the writings and interviews, we got to dig in once the archive was beginning to be processed more fully around 2010. And then as Flavin said, in 2013, with the completion of Spring Street, we were able to really focus our attention. But in terms of retranscribing from audio and video and typing up all the writings, you know, we started working on the project around, you know, 2011, 2012, and worked pretty consistently on the writings. And then as soon as the writings were done, we jumped into the interviews. And then in terms of things that are left, the comprehensivity, certainly we had that in mind, and we're trying to make as many resources available as possible. There's one project that it will happen in the future thinking more about Judd and architecture, and there's a body of Judd's writings in a 1989 architecture volume. Some of them, most of them were included in the writings, but there are a handful that will be part of that volume when we get around to it.
And generally, we tried to include anything that was at all interesting. So leave out the grocery store lists, but put in notes that seemingly don't make any sense, but might be interesting somehow.
One attendee is asking if the MoMA show will be extended. I don't know if either of you have any news on that front.
They're trying to, and we'll see.
Yeah, there's going to be a virtual view program beginning for the Judd show, I believe on April 23rd. And Anne Temkin, the lead curator in Flavin, will be in conversation, I think on the April 30th. And there's a reading group that MoMA's forming as well. So either on MoMA's page or through Judd Foundation, there are other activities that are going on while MoMA is closed right now. But we hope it can be extended, certainly.
Dennis is asking, he's saying that his favorite piece of Judd's writing is, it's hard to find a good lamp. And he's asking Flavin if you have memories of your father's early work in furniture.
Well, the early work in furniture was the two desks that occupied my and Rainer's rooms in Texas. Those were basically the first furniture was for our rooms. Prior to that, Don bought furniture, but as he says in the text, there was none to buy in Marfa unless you wanted it in plastic. So the early furniture is kids' furniture. It just happens to be suitable for everybody. And it just got more complex when the fancier versions started to be made in the late 80s and mid 80s in New York City. Prior to that, it was all made in Texas by the Celedonio Mediano and Alfredo, who were making the anything out of wood, who were the carpenters who were working for Don and Marfa. So it was just basically a very pragmatic solution to something that was missing.
And actually, speaking of Marfa and the connections to the community there, Arturo was asking if there's any relation with Mexican culture to Judd's work. And yeah, it might be interesting to hear about the role of Mexico in his writings.
Well, Marfa is a substitute Mexico because we started off by going to Baja California when we lived in New York, and we would drive the Land Rover to LA and then drop down to Baja California, but the border was a real problem, so that didn't work. So Don had an appreciation for local culture, whether it was in Switzerland, Texas, Mexico, wherever he might have been. And he thought it was important to have an appreciation for that. For instance, I was surprised when he was working on the rock work at the ranch. There are these big walls around a tank, and they were doing it in a certain way that I thought was different, and it seemed strange to me. And I asked Don about it, and he said, well, the two guys who are doing it, that's how they do it. And so that's how it's being done. And he felt it was important that these two guys who were from Chihuahua in Mexico had a certain way of working, and you couldn't tell them how to do it because they had a certain way and you had to respect their way of working. I think he had a respect for anything that was well done, regardless of the culture. And the culture one of the cultures he knew the best, to more or less, was Mexico. Yeah,
and I think, where we're situated in Marfa, I'm in Marfa based, we're in the Chihuahuan Desert. The Chihuahuan Desert is not specific to the US or Mexico. It's binational. We're in a bilingual area. And so the ranch that Judd spent time at and where he was really actively trying to preserve that land, that land doesn't know that it's in the US or in Mexico. It's the same ecological system. And I think Judd's library, going back to that, really attests to his deep interest in understanding this region, which is not defined in national terms, but is instead defined as a multilingual, multicultural, ecologically diverse part of the Chihuahuan Desert. And I think he had a great understanding for that, and the library really speaks to that in terms of the books on ecology and history and culture of this area.
Here's an interesting question. Francis is writing, I find his work very spiritual, and compares it to Rothko. Did Donald Judd ever refer to his work as spiritual? I would say
he was the least spiritual person.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Ever find, but when Jack Wesley and his wife Hannah Green went down to see the aluminum works at Chinati, because Jack Wesley was the first artist in residence in 1983 at Chinati. When they went to see the aluminum works, Hannah Green, they walked in, they walked around, and Hannah said, "Oh, it's almost like a religious experience." And Don's response was, "What do you mean almost?" So while he was not a spiritual person, he was very much into, I don't know how to put this, the product or the source of spiritualism, which is kind of an overwhelming awe of the world. And so, I mean, Don's work is all about the here and now and the present and the short life we have and being within that short life. So there's probably a connection somewhere, but he was a devout atheist, so.
What are some volumes that we would be surprised to find in Judd's library? And by extension, was there anything that surprised you as you went through this process as editors and archivists?
Caitlin?
Volumes in the library, I mean, so I have I'm a librarian by training, and I've been fortunate to work in some pretty amazing libraries, but and I was fortunate to catalog Judd's library here in Marfa. And I think what really struck me was the diversity of the library as a whole. I mean, just extraordinary breadth, and to have a literature section, astronomy, mathematics, books from different languages, and some of the things that I came to understand by cataloging the library was that there would be large tomes, for example, from Iceland that are in Icelandic sagas. And, Judd didn't read Icelandic, but these books were reflective of a cultural heritage and material culture of a place he traveled and a place that he liked. And so even if he couldn't, even if he did not read Icelandic, the book had a material quality that was significant, and I really appreciated that. So I think also I was surprised that there was as much literature as there was. I don't know. My dad was a historian and pretty much primarily only read history and had very little time for novels. And Judd's library has a surprising amount of, they're definitely within the realm of the classics, the novels that one should read. But it's a pretty good literary collection, I have to say.
I think we should probably wrap up the discussion soon. And before we did, I just wanted to ask if there was anything either of you wanted to say that we didn't cover. No.
I guess one thing I'll say is that you can obviously, the books are available, and you should buy them to support your local bookstores. But we are also including selections of writings on our website and more content on our website at juddfoundation.org. And so please, if you haven't read any of Judd's writings and you're interested in seeing what they're like, you can go to our website, and we have a number of essays that you can download as PDFs.
I want to thank Caitlin and Flavin for this illuminating discussion. And yes, I agree. Having read both of these volumes, I really think that people in the art world today interested in art, aesthetics, and politics could really find a lot to grapple with in these texts. Not all of them are easy. You could be a difficult, challenging thinker, but it's quite a rewarding project nonetheless. So thank you for everyone who participated. We had a great turnout this evening. And thanks again to Flavin, Caitlin, and everyone at Art in America, the Judd Foundation, and David Zwerner, who supported this conversation tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you.